Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, I want to say hello and thank you to everybody for joining us today for this webinar on DEQ's Toxic Focus List. I'm Dan Brown, I believe one of the presenters today, and I just wanted to talk quickly about a few logistics for this webinar. As you probably heard me just say, we will be recording this conversation today, and we want to provide the best audio that we can for people unable to attend. So we've currently muted everyone. We will be taking questions periodically during the presentation today. So if you do have a question, you can enter it in the chat box, and then we will answer we'll cycle back to all of the questions when we get to the next questions break. We're planning to take about 3 questions breaks during the presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end. If you are unable to ask your question or get it in, if we don't answer it, feel free to email any one of the presenters today. Our email addresses will be available on the final slide. Let's see, the presentation itself takes about 20 minutes to get through. Obviously, if we have more questions during one of those breaks, that'll extend that time a little bit. But we are planning to leave plenty of time for questions today. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to DEQ Deputy Director Leah Feldon. Leah, are you there? And she's probably on mute, so that doesn't help. All right, Leah, are you there?
I am here. That worked. Thank you.
I'll get you to your
All right. Thanks so much, Dan. So welcome, everybody. Again, I'm Leah Feldon, and we really appreciate you all joining us today for this webinar. We're glad to be able to bring this updated focus list to you in this format. And first and foremost, I really want to thank Dan Brown, who you just heard from, and also Kevin Masterson for their work on this presentation today. So they put the presentation together for you and have done the preparation to bring this updated focus list to you. So thanks to both of them for their work. I'm just going to open up with the first 2 slides just as sort of a ground setting and reminder for everyone about DEQ's toxics reduction strategy, a little bit of the background on that, again, just as a refresher, and also some of the guiding principles. And then I'll be handing it back to Dan and Kevin. So since 2009, DEQ has largely organized its work on toxics into the toxics reduction strategy. And the first version of that was finalized in 2012. And this was based on a determination that the agency should be looking at toxic pollutants from all programs in a more comprehensive and strategic way, recognizing that many toxic pollutants, of course, readily cross environmental media boundaries, and that our approach to toxics, of course, then needed to be integrated and comprehensive as well. As most folks, I think, know, DEQ sort of divides up its work into air, land, and water divisions. And so this was a recognition that we really wanted to bring the work on toxics together and not keep it siloed in those different areas. And additionally, I would say we really needed a forum to consider emerging contaminants and how those transcend the media boundaries as well. So the toxics reduction strategy describes what actions DEQ and partners will take and the things that DEQ should prioritize to further the toxics reduction work for the agency. The strategy also aims to focus actions on addressing toxics at all stages of the life cycle, a really important component here, including an upstream approach of pollution prevention. The upstream approach can help us achieve greater gains from preventing pollutants at their source, rather than trying to remove chemicals from the environment once they've already been released. And reducing toxics at the point of initial use can reduce regulatory burdens as well, and often produce cost savings for businesses. So some of these attributes of the strategy also really highlight the need for the partnerships that we have and why the partnerships are so critical to this work. Next slide, please, Dan. So during the first years of the strategy, we focused much of our attention on 5 major actions. An example, broad support and stable funding was provided for the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program, and allowed the program to work on reducing pesticides in water and in more areas of the state. But the guiding principles that you see here really have transcended both the first strategy and the updated strategy. In 2012, the strategy also coincided and coordinated with a governor's executive order on green chemistry, which allowed DEQ to support and advance various efforts to reduce toxics in Oregon, including state purchasing. So making sure that we were able to build on some of the successes from the 2012 strategy, we wanted to make sure that the same guiding principles were carried forward into the 2019 update of the strategy. So the strategy was updated in 2019, and these principles stayed largely the same. So building on success, as you see there, was included in the strategy's guiding principles during the 2019 update, alongside ensuring effective communication, incorporating environmental justice interests, maintaining engagement with communities, taking an integrated approach to toxics reduction, and creating and sustaining implementation partnerships, as I mentioned before. So I'm going to turn the presentation now over to Kevin Masterson, who is our agency's toxics coordinator, and also Dan Brown, who you've already heard from. Dan is the project manager for Teen Toxics, and they'll give you more information on the toxics reduction strategy and the updated focus list. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, Leah. I really appreciate you being here and giving us that introduction. It's very nice to hear and get a good sense of the background. This is Dan Brown again. You heard me earlier. The first thing that I'd like to do here is to reiterate the importance of, oops, there we go, these 4 ideas that you see on the slide, and how important they are to DEQ's toxics reduction strategy. Leah touched on each of them during her introduction, and our team has incorporated them into each of our strategy actions. During the first years of the strategy, we focused on just 5 main actions. Over the time, though, we've expanded that and now have 14 strategy actions underway or in planning stages. We'll highlight some of those actions later in this presentation, but one that will be the main focus of today's presentation is the focus list. So, what is this list and how is it used? The focus list itself was originally developed as part of the initial 2012 toxics reduction strategy. It's a cross-program list of priority chemicals derived from 10 program priority lists used by DEQ, OHA, and other regional initiatives. The list helps direct implementation of strategy actions. Given that there are tens of thousands of chemicals in commerce, we need to focus on a smaller subset of chemicals and pollutants. The list also informs others about agency-wide toxics reduction priorities, including other entities in Oregon and outside the state who are interested in state toxic chemical priorities, such as retailers interested in reducing certain chemicals in products. So our considerations in updating the focus list were derived from existing state or regional priority lists for regulatory, pollution prevention, and environmental assessment programs. For the recent update of this list, our leadership directed us to place more emphasis on public health, and we did this by designating the consumer and commercial products chemical category as a separate media type, along with air, water, and land quality. We also added chemicals from the 2015 Toxics Free Kids Act priority chemical list to those considered for the focus list. And we also included Cleaner Air Oregon emission inventory data and drinking water monitoring data in this list of considered chemicals. It's not all add and no remove, however. We did drop the use of 2 priority lists from the 2012 list, and that were, excuse me, deemed either no longer relevant or considered duplicative. And I think I blew through the first questions section there. Does anybody have any? I apologize for that. I didn't see any questions come through on the chat, so I think if it's all right with everybody, I'm just gonna keep going. So yeah, that is what we considered when updating the focus list and how the focus list is used. And now I'll switch into what goes into the focus list and how a chemical might get on how it meets criteria. So here we see the criteria for a chemical to make it onto the focus list are the same as they were in 2012. It needs to be on 3 or more established program priority lists across at least 2 environmental media. The difference between the 2012 list development process and the current one is that there are now 10 instead of 12 priority lists, as I mentioned. But there are now also 4 environmental media categories instead of 3 due to the addition of consumer and commercial products. There are several water quality related toxic chemical or pollutant priority lists used by DEQ or interagency collaborations, whereas the DEQ Air Quality Division has a single updated preliminary priority list based on data from multiple sources, including Cleaner Air Oregon, on non-point and mobile source programs. All chemicals on the 10 existing priority lists were contained in a master spreadsheet that we call our base list. And that list, you should have received a link to it yesterday. That list is available on our webpage or by request. So feel free to email us afterwards if you'd like a copy of that list. We're going to take a look at that now. Here we go. It's a little closer look at what's on the list. So here you see the 10 different priority lists that were on there. I'll save you listening to me read all of the different names of those and give you a chance to read over them. I do want to point out, as we said, that some of these lists do come from outside the agency, such as the Columbia River Toxics Reduction Partnership. Also land quality, one of the land quality lists is in conjunction with EPA as well. So there are some outside agency lists on there. And that is how we get on the list. And from there, I believe Kevin Masterson will be taking over. So Kevin, it's all yours. Here's your slide. All right.
Hey,
Yours, Kevin.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan and Leah. Again, as Dan said, my name is Kevin Masterson, and I'm DEQ's Agency Toxics Coordinator. So I do work across various programs and regions on toxics reduction and assessment issues. And I've been working on this strategy in various forms since we kicked it off in 2009-10. And so it's great to see it come to the point where it's at right now. And we are excited to have this new list that we can use for our strategy actions. As Dan said, we did add and subtract chemicals from that list. In 2012, we had a total of 51 chemicals or classes of chemicals. And by classes of chemicals, I mean things like PCBs and PBDEs, which are flame retardants, where we just designated the entire class rather than just specific individual constituents. So the 14 chemicals that were added to the focus list include 5 consumer product chemicals, or ones that are in commercial products, 4 metals, 3 volatile organic compounds, and 2 flame retardants. And these are general classifications. In some cases, some of these chemicals can cross borders. Some are both combustion byproducts as well as volatile organic compounds. So there is some guessing that we have to do in order to put it in the right category. However, we also looked at 5 chemicals that came off the list once we applied the criteria to the updated foundational list that we were using in air, water, land, and consumer products. And of those 5 chemicals, 4 of them were pesticides, 2 current use pesticides and 2 legacy pesticides. The 2 current use pesticides just have been detected less frequently in our surface water monitoring around the state over the last 5 or so years. And so they're not as much of a priority. And the same thing with the legacy pesticides. They aren't as much of a cleanup driver as they were, say, 10 years ago. Next slide. So this slide is the focus list on one page. We do have a more detailed version of this that shows all the subconstituents that are under each class, but this is sort of the simple version of the updated focus list. And for the time being, we are making sure that people can get an idea of what was removed and what was added. And you can see anything in red is a new chemical on the list. Anything with a strike through has been removed. That way people can see the changes between 2012 and 2018. Again, we went from 51 chemicals or chemical classes now to 60, 14 added, 5 removed, so we had net gain of 9 chemicals. Again, if you're looking at the 85,000 chemicals in commerce plus all the legacy compounds, 60 is still a pretty small number. That doesn't mean we're not working on other chemicals. It's just in terms of our cross-program, cross-media priorities, these are the ones that rise to the top. One of the most noteworthy additions to this list is the inclusion of PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which have been getting a lot of attention across the country. They're a very persistent and toxic emerging contaminant, especially for drinking water, but there are other environmental concerns we're just learning about and other pathways to the environment. So it's that one is highlighted because of all of the efforts that are going into work around that right now. 4 other chemicals that are common ingredients in commercial and consumer products also made the list, and the addition of the Toxics Free Kids Act priority list was a major factor in those chemicals being included. That Toxics Free chemical list, which is known as the high priority chemical list for children's health, that program is operated by the Oregon Health Authority with DEQ providing some support. That list of 68 chemicals for that particular program was also a primary driver for additional metals and volatile organic compounds that were on the list, although the updates that were made to some of our air quality, water quality, and cleanup program priority lists also contributed to those chemical additions for VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and metals. Next slide.
I believe, Kevin, I think we wanted to take a quick break before we jump into that to see if there were any questions. So take a quick scroll through the chat here. I'm not seeing any. We will take another break in a few minutes. So if you have a question about anything that's on this list, feel free to type it into the chat box and we'll answer it after a couple more slides. So away you go, Kevin.
Okay, great. So we're not going to highlight all 14 chemicals that were added to the list, but we did want to highlight a few just to give you an idea of why there are concerns and how they may affect human health and the environment. The first, of course, is the PFAS, which are the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. For those of you that aren't familiar with this class of chemicals, there are about 4,500 of them. And a lot of the regulatory focus at the national level and in other states is focused on just a couple of the older legacy compounds. But it is a pretty daunting list of chemicals in this class, and they're used for a range of different processes and products. A lot of consumer products, including cookware, furniture, carpet, food packaging. You've probably heard about firefighting foam. These chemicals are used and have been used in firefighting foam. And when training or firefighting happens outside, there's a quick release into the environment, and that's where a lot of the contamination has come from, or at least that's been discovered thus far. There are also some specific industrial uses, including chrome plating and some paper coating operations. But because they're so ubiquitous in consumer products, PFAS also concentrate in wastewater and landfill leachate. So wastewater treatment plants and landfills are sort of concentrators for all these contaminants that come their way. They're not sources of these pollutants, but rather pathways, intermediate pathways. So we see higher concentrations in wastewater and landfill leachate in some cases based on that concentration. And they readily move between surface and groundwater. So you can have groundwater contamination that leads to surface water contamination because of that movement. And now air deposition is being evaluated as another contributor to soil and water contamination. So DEQ, in coordination with the Oregon Health Authority, has been working on assessing and reducing PFAS in Oregon. And we now have a separate web page that's summarizing what we do and don't know in Oregon and the reduction efforts that are underway. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in our work on PFAS. Next slide. So in 2012, when the strategy was released along with the focus list, we had a category called flame retardants, and the only class of flame retardants that we had in that category were polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs. These are persistent toxic materials that also bioaccumulate, so they were definitely a problem, similar to PCBs in terms of the way they function in the environment. However, most of those PBDs and the uses of those PBDs have been phased out. That doesn't mean they're still not a problem in the environment because of their persistent nature, but largely they're out of current consumer products and processes. However, there are a couple of flame retardants that made our list this time around based on the updates that we did to our existing list and the Toxics Free Kids list. Those are known as TCEP and TDCP, and those two flame retardants are actively used in commerce, primarily used in things like polyurethane foam for furniture and other upholstered materials, building insulation, and electronics. So they're quite widely used, and both are classified as chlorinated organophosphate substances. And as a result, they're quite toxic and considered, at least TCEP is considered a carcinogen by the California Environmental Health and Hazard Office. And exposure to both of these flame retardants can be through inhalation of household dust, dermal contact, as well as drinking water. DEQ has occasionally detected these chemicals in surface water through some of our limited toxics monitoring efforts recently, although we just added them to our monitoring suite a couple of years ago. So consumer contact is definitely one of the main concerns, household dust, but they can make their way into water. The next slide. And finally, I wanted to highlight a couple of volatile organic compounds that were newly added to the list. Acetaldehyde and styrene, which can both have human health impacts in the indoor and outdoor environments. Acetaldehyde is emitted by various types of wood-based materials and products and through other industrial processes. And it ranks in the top 5 in terms of quantity of toxic air pollutants emitted from industrial facilities according to the latest Cleaner Air Oregon emissions inventory that we have. And styrene is used also in a variety of industrial processes, most notably fiberglass manufacturing, or the manufacture of fiberglass products. And it is an extremely volatile compound. It's also contained in polystyrene-based consumer products, which is the reason why it's on the Toxics Free Kids Act list, because there can be exposure through some of these polystyrene-based products. Both acetaldehyde and styrene are also found in automobile exhaust and other fuel combustion processes. So it's not just in products in industrial processes. And also, I should note that even though indoor and outdoor air inhalation are the primary health concerns for these compounds, they can also be potential drinking water contaminants. So we'll take a break there before we finish up with some of the summaries of actions that are being implemented right now under the toxic strategy. I don't know if there are any in the chat box right now.
Kevin, I'm not seeing any right now, so I think we can just go ahead and finish off the last couple of slides, and then we'll see if there are any questions after that.
Okay, great. So we just wanted to give a high-level overview of a few of the toxics reduction strategy actions that we're currently implementing, and again, using the focus list as the driver for what we concentrate on in terms of contaminants and pollutants. The first relates to state and local government purchasing, and Leah referenced this earlier with regard to the governor's executive order that was issued in 2012, the same year that we completed our toxics reduction strategy. And that executive order called for more emphasis on low toxicity purchasing by the state. Local governments can join a lot of these state contracts and purchasing agreements to provide more leverage and get more purchasing power. And the whole idea is to not only green state activities and walk our talk, but also to drive the market towards safer alternatives. And so using those state purchasing guidelines and specs to lower toxicity of products purchased by the state is still a key element of our toxics reduction strategy. What we're doing now is building on the success that we had before in things like janitorial supplies, and also combining it with combining our efforts with the priorities of our materials management program. Some of the recent purchasing initiatives of the Department of Administrative Services that were supported by our materials management program include the maintenance, repair, and operations contract. It was updated in 2018, so there were some chemicals restricted as part of that updated contract. And as you can imagine, maintenance, repair, and operations covers a wide gamut of different activities. The recent purchasing initiatives of the Department of Administrative Services and DEQ also focus on furniture. We're also working with Oregon Corrections Enterprises, which manufactures some furniture for state agencies. And so those efforts have been ongoing now for a while, and we're making a lot of progress on trying to get about 5 different priority chemicals or chemical classes out of furniture. And those include flame retardants, PFAS for stain resistance, antibacterials like triclosan, bottle organics like formaldehyde and vinyl chloride. And there are a lot of options there on the market now to make that successful. On the horizon, we're looking at some new opportunities related to carpet, where you also have flame retardants and bottle organics and PFAS. So a lot of the same chemicals, as well as possibly apparel. So those chemical categories are ones that we hope to be working with Department of Administrative Services on in the future. So with that, I have one more here before I pass it off to Sue. One of our goals is to advance transition to safer chemicals and products through informed substitution. There's a whole discipline out there now on chemical alternatives assessment. It is part of the entire pollution prevention set of options out there, but it is really the focus of a lot of work by other states to make sure that we don't have regrettable substitutes. And we've all been down this road. Those of us have been working in this field for quite a long time, where we thought we found a new safer chemical, but it just hadn't been studied that much. And we find out later that it has chemical physical properties that may be different than the old chemicals, but just as worse. And so what we're trying to do with some of the work that is coming under this strategy is to try to work on alternative assessments. Some of that has been done through interstate collaborations where we share work, also through grant funds. We've received from EPA grant funds to advance research on alternatives. For instance, we got some funds to work with Northwest Green Chemistry, which is a research nonprofit, on a roadmap for conducting a comprehensive alternatives assessment for PFAS and food packaging. That's being now used by the Washington Department of Ecology's contractor, and they have a law to ban food packaging in that state, as long as there are available substitutes. So this is a piece of the overall effort that's happening, again, in concert with other states. And most recently, we're close to finalizing a report and technical assistance fact sheets with Northwest Green Chemistry on chemical alternatives and pollution prevention opportunities for priority industrial air toxics. Again, some of those volatile organic compounds that we talked about before are examples of those. So those documents will be available hopefully within the next month or so. We're also working closely with states and local, other states and Oregon local governments on identifying both information needs and opportunities to transition away from PFAS firefighting foam. There are a lot of alternatives out there, but we want to make sure not only are they safer, but they work for those firefighters in emergency situations. Next slide. And I will pass this off to Sue McMillan in our air quality program.
Hi, everybody. Air quality is very interested in what's going on with diesel particulate matter, and a couple of our items made it to the Toxics Reduction Strategy program. And although we also are doing things like working with the VW Grants Fund, that kind of thing, that's not what we're talking about here. The two things we've concentrated on are assessing diesel particulate matter emissions and impacts. And then the second thing is building demand for clean diesel engines. And each of these kind of have three phases. In terms of assessing diesel particulate matter, the first phase involved, and has already been completed, performing a vulnerability assessment and identifying emission factors for railroad, marine, construction, and trucking diesel. The next phase is actual monitoring, which is due to take place in the Jade and Cully neighborhoods, but of course things are a little twisted up because of COVID-19, so not sure exactly when that will be done. But once that is completed, phase 3 will involve community engagement. So we're looking forward really to the community engagement part of that, once we've got some data to show them and talk about with them. And then in terms of building demand for clean diesel engines, the second thing, we have already completed a non-road diesel survey, looking at things like engines used off-road in construction and agriculture and other areas. Phase 2 will be getting community feedback. We'll refine the standards for trying to kind of control these diesel emissions and kind of a standard adoption process for those. And eventually, phase 3 will involve program design, solidifying interagency relationships, which are already in year, by the way, on this, and preparation for phase-ins in 2021. So you won't see diesel particulate matter as a compound chemical listed in our focus list, but rather its components, which are the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, some of the volatile organic compounds, and some of the metals. And that's all I've got for right now, unless there are questions later.
Great, thanks, Sue. This is Kevin again, and I just wanted to wrap up by talking about one more strategy action that is underway, and it's a longer term strategy where we're trying to look for opportunities to incorporate environmental justice into the Oregon Pesticide Stewardship Partnership Program. And Leah had mentioned this earlier, that one of the primary short-term implementation actions that we had in 2012 was to expand and get broader support for the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership, which is focused on reducing current use pesticides in water. And with a broad coalition of grower groups and environmental groups and EPA and a lot of other agencies, we were able to do that and got support through the legislature to fund that program in a long-term sustainable way. And we are achieving successes. In fact, the biennial report for that program is about to be released, showing a lot of improvements and improving trends in waters around the state. But one of the things that we felt could be emphasized more was environmental justice. And so rather than trying to change the focus of the program, the recommendation that DEQ had to the interagency team that manages the partnership program was to incorporate environmental justice where possible into the program, whether that be where we pick monitoring, the kinds of reduction and stewardship actions we're pursuing and who we involve, as well as things like pesticide collection events. And so to that end, there has been the development of a statewide high-level strategic plan that does mention EJ considerations as something important to look at when we're forming new partnerships and building on existing watershed-based partnerships. We also have a stakeholder advisory group now that's been formed as of last fall that has broad representation, including groups with a focus on environmental justice. So those are two sort of foundational efforts that we've taken to help advance this goal. Again, it's going to be a long-term process where we work with other state partners and local watershed implementing partners to make this happen on the ground. But it is something that we wanted to let people know is a way that we are taking some of the principles that Leah talked about at the beginning and trying to incorporate them in ongoing programs. And again, this is adding another feature and enhancement to the program rather than changing its direction in any way. And that is all I had on that one. I'm going to go to the wrap-up slides. Dan, do you want to finish off, or do you want me to?
I can take it from here.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you both to you, Kevin and Sue. I really appreciate you guys giving that information. Here's just a quick list of our Team Toxics members, as well as the folks that are on our governance team. Take a quick look at that, just so you know that we do have representation from different programs within the agency, as well as the different regions around the state, so that we are trying to be as inclusive as we can and get as much coverage around the state to make sure that we are getting as much information and perspective as we can on the team. So like I said, thank you all for being here. And let's see. Here are our email addresses in case you have any questions that we don't get to during the question session that we have. We have about 20 minutes, and I do see some questions have come in, so thank you to everyone who has sent me the questions through the chat, and we'll get started here. All right, the first question kind of goes back to some of the chemicals that we were focused on. Kevin, I think this one would be one for you. It says methyl bromide is used as a fumigant primarily by shipping companies. EPA has exempted this chemical but has restricted its use. Does Oregon regulate this fumigant? Is it illegal in Oregon?
It is not completely illegal, and I saw that Lori Gordon was on the line, and she might be able to answer this question better than I, because she answered questions for me that I had about methyl bromide a few months ago. But suffice to say, the uses of methyl bromide are quite limited in Oregon. And so we are largely following the lead of EPA. Oregon Department of Ag does have the ability to regulate current use pesticides under its own authorities. And I'm not sure that there are specific methyl bromide requirements that Oregon has, but I do know that the uses of that particular fumigant have been largely phased out, and there are some really very small and defined special uses that are out there.
Okay,
Lori can, if Lori's still on the line, she could type in something in the chat to correct me or to add to it.
All right. While we're waiting to see if she might want to do that, we'll move on to the next question. Are there any best management practices that we can suggest to fire departments that could help keep chemicals out of waterways during trainings, such as booms or to factor out catch basins after trainings? Is that something that we would do?
I think it would be a part of any sort of outreach that we do as part of the fluorine-free foam transition education that goes on, not just providing people with information on alternative chemicals to use for firefighting and training, but also best management practices that they can use to limit the release of any of these compounds. And that is a good point to make, because even the alternatives may have some impact, even if it's just on like the biological oxygen demand readings in a creek or a stream. Even if the toxicity is low, it's going to still probably, some of that foam suck oxygen out of the stream. So I think that's a very good point. It's something that we could bring up to the State Farm Marshal's office, who we're working with on some of this outreach and education. Again, we're assembling that information and vetting some of the alternatives to make sure they're safer, but being able to talk about some of those best management practices in terms of using booms, Vector trucks or whatever to remove any of the spilled contaminants, I think is an excellent suggestion, and something that we will take back to our partners, make sure that it's included in any of those outreach materials.
All right, great. Thanks, Kevin. Sue, the next question is for you. Oh, actually, we have one question and one clarification. It looks like the project in the Jade community has been running since the beginning of the year. So that's just a little update there. And then, Sue, the question is, has the state of Oregon, how is the state of Oregon using the Volkswagen settlement funds to address diesel emissions?
So that's not my area of expertise. Eric Feely of our air quality department would be the one to contact. His last name is spelled F-E-E-L-E-Y. Sorry, I can't answer that right this minute.
That's all right. I will put the, I'll send you to the person that asked the question, I will send you his email address through the chat. And I think we have one more question here. Okay. Just to cycle back, Lori did mention for methyl bromide, it still has some very limited applications for use in Oregon, but is generally used in very limited circumstances. One of these uses, one of the uses in Klamath Falls area for farmers that raise strawberry starts for other farmers to grow. Back in 2010 and 2012, EPA tightened up the uses and use areas for most soil fumigants, and she says that she would be happy to provide the information to anyone who's interested. So Lori, I will connect you with the person who asked that question. I really appreciate you giving a little bit more clarification. So our last question that we have currently is that, does the strategy include an avenue for eliminating chemicals that have been on red lists for decades, or to set a new standard for chemical management? For example, Mexico recently announced phase out or elimination of glyphosate from its agriculture by 2024.
Well, this is Kevin. I'll start, and maybe others can chime in. But in terms of those on the red list, you will see a lot of overlap between those red lists and what's on our focus list. And a lot of those are already heavily regulated by DEQ and EPA on the back end in terms of pollution management. And we're trying to fill in some of those gaps for those regulatory programs using incentives, using partnerships, and trying to use the levers of procurement, for example, to create market forces that drive people away from some of those highly toxic chemicals. And that's part of the reason for the strategy. And obviously, if some of those strategies and actions don't work, then that's something for our agency and leadership team and maybe other agencies to talk about. What are the other steps? Do we have to take other actions? Obviously, with regard to non-pesticides, everything that's not a pesticide is covered by the Toxic Substances Control Act. Those chemicals are regulated at the federal level, and EPA has the ability to restrict those chemicals in commerce by doing risk assessments. And DEQ, the Oregon Department of Justice, have been commenting along with other states on some rulemaking dockets related to risk assessments that hopefully will be comprehensive and that EPA will take action nationwide on some of the worst chemicals, or certainly restrict their uses, if not eliminate them altogether. When it comes to the state of Oregon taking action on any of these that are a problem for our state, DEQ doesn't have the authority right now to ban those chemicals. We would have to get that authority from the state legislature. Secondly, I mentioned the Toxics Free Kids Act, and that was a driver and a factor for adding some of these chemicals that we talked about earlier. There are 68 chemicals as mentioned on that list, and that is something that's pretty unique in that the legislature did give Oregon Health Authority the ability to not only require reporting of what's in products in terms of those 68 chemicals, but also be able to require a subset of them to be phased out over time if they are malleable or meet other criteria. So that is an example of a statute that it's existing now, that does provide a state agency with some of that authority. Again, it's in limited instances and for a limited number of chemicals.
All right, thank you for that, Kevin. That was a good answer. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat box. So that kind of brings us to the end of our presentation today. I will keep the meeting open for the next 10 minutes in case anybody has something that they would like to ask. But I want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today. We had a great turnout. We had over 50 people, which I'm very happy to say is a good turnout for sure. Feel free to email any of the three of us that presented today if you have any additional questions. We also have a Gov delivery list, which I believe is linked on our webpage for the toxic reduction strategy, which was in the invite for this presentation. So if you would like to continue to get updates about happenings with Team Toxics, please feel free to join the Gov delivery, and we will update you periodically. With that, I just want to say thank you to Sue and Kevin, and especially Leah, for helping with the presentation today. And thank you to everyone who joined.